Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Morgan. I'm one of the 2 research scientists in the Developer Success Lab at Pluralsight Flow with my fellow colleague, Carol Lee. First of all, it's Friday, so that's exciting. Congratulations, we made it. Woohoo! Second, this is our first time here, so thank you so much for the invitation. We're super excited to be here. And a quick housekeeping thing, everything we're going to throw at you today is a compilation of like 4 to 5 different research studies. So we're going to keep it high level, but if you're interested in anything we say, want to go deeper, we have a QR code at the very end. Take a screenshot of that. You can download all of the talks that we're having right now or all of the papers that we'll have in our talk, and we'll be around after. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Carol.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So like Morgan said, my name is Carol. I am a clinical scientist in the Developer Success Lab at Flow. What that really means is that I'm a clinical psychologist who also conducts research on how people, like you amazing developers, work, cope, and thrive through times of stress, which I'm sure we all experience here, right? All right, so I want to start with a little fun fact about being a psychologist. So just kind of bear with me here. Okay, so when you are a psychologist, upon telling somebody that you're a psychologist, I'm going to say there is like we're going to say 30%, okay? There's like a 30% chance that they will ask you if you can read minds. I don't know why this happens so often, but it does. Obviously, the answer to this is no, I can't read minds. You're thinking of a psychic, not a psychologist. At this point, usually people pretend like they were joking when they weren't. No, I can't read minds. I'm so sorry. It's very disappointing, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So the funny thing about this, though, is that psychologists actually think about mind reading kind of a lot. We just don't think about it in the psychic sense. We think about this as a cognitive bias where we assume that we know what other people are thinking, feeling, and believing. I want to reiterate, this is not a psychic thing. This is just some good old-fashioned biased human behavior. All right. Now, the thing about mind reading is that we all do this. We do this about really small things, like assuming that everybody likes chocolate. But we also do this about really big and important things, too, like assuming that we all know and agree on what it means to succeed as a developer, something that we see on software teams quite a bit, actually. So just to kind of highlight this, I'm going to do a quick little experimental poll, okay? We're going to do this by raise of hands. I want you to answer this question. Which of these is the most important characteristic of a successful developer? A, completes work that is usable and valuable to the org. B, is able to commit a complete work despite tech debt. C, commits a lot of code. D, has a lot of pull requests. And then E, writes high quality code. So take a minute, think about your answer. Okay, so raise your hand if you think A. Don't be shy, okay. Interesting. Raise your hand if you think B. C, D, and finally E. Interesting. This is so interesting, I'm sorry. Okay, all right. So I'm trying not to analyze you all as I stand up here. Okay, I'm like, take notes, Morgan. Okay, all right. So kind of notice that not everybody chose the same thing here. Right? And this is pretty normal. We all have our own definitions and ideas of what success means to us personally. So here's a quick follow-up question. Thinking back to that characteristic you just chose, okay? Is this the primary way that your success has been evaluated thus far? So if you said, hey, the important thing is, I don't know, code quality, has your work been evaluated based on code quality? Raise your hand if that's the case. Okay, so not a lot of raised hands, right? In fact, most of us are not raising our hands. So what does that tell us? Okay, one important thing that tells us is the way that we define and measure success for ourselves isn't always the way that we are defined and measured externally in our orgs, right? And this nicely highlights one of the biggest problems with mind reading, is that when you engage in mind reading, you actually run the risk of being really misaligned on really big and important things, like how you have been successful in your careers. And if you think about it, that's actually kind of a big deal, because as a developer, your career growth more or less depends on everyone around you agreeing or being aligned, right, on the fact that you have been successful. And we actually see this in our data as well. So for example, in this study that we conducted, we see some evidence of misalignment in this orange box here. Just gonna highlight some of these major misalignment points for you, okay? So if you look in this box here, you see that a lot of folks say, hey, we are currently being measured by things like number of pull requests, number of code reviews, number of code commits, right? Much more than they really want to be. We see more misalignment in this green box here, where folks say that what they really want to be evaluated on is based on things like code quality much more than they currently are. We see even more misalignment when we break this down by role, where when we ask ICs, we see that they say, hey, we think that there's a lot of focus on the usability and value of work to the organization, as well as the number of pull requests. But what we really want is a focus on code review quality and code quality. You see a really interesting misalignment point here when you look at managers, though. Managers say the opposite. They're like, I actually think we do look at code quality and longevity. What we want more of is this usability and value of work to the org, right? So you're seeing this flip-flop misalignment here. All right, so why is this misalignment happening, right? One of the biggest reasons why this happens is that we tend to choose inappropriate measures of success because we actually haven't taken the time to define what success means, right? At the end of the day, your measures are only as good as your definitions. The other thing is that we tend to engage in mind reading. We assume that we know what our teammates, managers, collaborators, et cetera, we think we know how they're defining and measuring success, and we assume that it's the same way that we're defining and measuring success. So what can you do, right? How do we manage this? All right, so one thing you can do instead of mind reading is you can define success before choosing your measures of success. This sounds really simple, but it's actually a really effective way to make sure that you're being aligned on the definitions and your measures of success. And then second of all, of course, you want to make sure that you're aligning on how you define and measure success across roles. So things like ICs versus managers versus leaders, et cetera. All right, so what does this look like in practice? So here's the thing that happens. Okay, so imagine that you have been asked to evaluate your team's success. Most of us have probably had to do this at some point, right? So a common mistake that folks will make is that they'll start by just making a list of every success measure that they can think of, right? They're like, I don't know, here are all the measures. They might write down things like raw counts of code commits and pull requests. They might look at the amount of work done given tech debt, maybe team size, access to resources and tooling. And then they might even look at things like code quality, longevity, maybe some of these socio-cultural factors that we know predict productivity, like agency, belonging, self-efficacy, motivation, learning, et cetera. So you make these list of measures, right? The second thing that we do is that we assume that all of these measures measure the same thing. You have just written down a list of success measures, and so you think, yeah, these all measure success. Great, move on, right? Because you assume that they all measure the same thing, most people will just choose the ones that seem the easiest to measure. You're busy, you're just gonna choose like the top 3 easiest things to do and move on from there, right? This is the mistake, because it turns out all of these measures of success don't actually measure the same thing. If you dive into our research, we actually see that things like raw counts of code commits and pull requests, that's actually a measure of something called team production. You're looking at the quantity of your team's output regardless of any resources provided to that team. No context whatsoever, right? If you take a look at things like tech debt, team size, access to resources and tooling, now you're talking about team productivity. This is what productivity is. You're looking at the quantity of output in light of or given the resources provided to a team. Finally, things like code quality, longevity, sociocultural factors, this is a measure of team performance. Now you're looking at things like the flexibility, adaptability, sustainability, and quality of output and resources over time, right? You're considering context through a longitudinal lens. All of it is to say that you really want to be defining what you mean by success before you actually measure them, right? Because at the end of the day, right, things like raw counts of code commits or the amount of tech debt that your team has, that is not going to measure team performance, no matter how much you want it to be, or no matter how loudly you say it's going to be, right? at the end of the day, if you want to be measuring things like team performance, you got to be looking at things like the code quality, code longevity, and these sociocultural factors. And then finally, of course, you also want to be talking about this with your teams. As we saw, there was misalignment on what ICs thought they were being measured on versus what managers thought they were measuring, right? That's a pretty big point of misalignment. You all should know exactly how your team is measuring success and how you're going to actually measure it. All right, so all of which is to say that instead of mind reading, one thing you can do is define success before measuring. And then finally, align on how you define and measure success across roles, right? Talk to your managers, your ICs, leaders, et cetera.
Yes, and in addition to that, we had, as I mentioned earlier, lots of different studies added in this. So we also want to explore this might be happening in your developer teams, but what might be happening with your collaborators? So we did a couple studies and realized, actually, as developers, you're not alone. If you might be thinking that you might have mind read a couple times or people are mind reading you, we actually did a study to understand kind of the ecosystem of what you work. And we all might have seen this product triad, either the top three, big three, running through, whatever you want to call it. Oftentimes, developers work on teams where there are designers, think of your UX researchers, UX designers, UX writers, and then product folks. So think of your product managers, product leaders, whoever they might be. So in a separate study, we really wanted to look into one of those relationships, particularly how developers understand product folks and how product people understand developers. I'm sure we all have thoughts about that already, but we wanted to double click into that to see what that was like. And primarily, as Carol was mentioning, we wanted to see how does mind reading affect our product partners? Does it? Are they seeing what we see? Are they seeing something completely different? And to do so, we wanted to focus on the question, in particular, what does productivity mean to you? In doing so, we had 17 hours of conversation with both product people and developers, and shocker, it was different. So developers are more so thinking from a quantitative lens, using words like speed and time to define how they perceive productivity. Whereas product managers were saying more qualitative terms, such as clarity or quality, to define how they saw productivity. So it was very clear from the very beginning, even just looking at the word productivity, that both sides were defining it very differently from the start. So then we were like, okay, that was cool. Now let's go into it a little bit deeper. If we're looking at productivity, how do we define developer productivity? And what does that mean to you? And to do so, we did a little bit of a kind of innovative way of going about it. So my background is in design research and UX research. I'm one of those designers on the bottom right. And what we learn in UX research is to learn from reality. So a way and kind of a concept that we were testing this perception was in a concept that we kind of have all seen, is this picture. If you've seen it, don't say it, it's part of the thing. But raise your hand if you kind of see a more mature woman in this photo. Raise them high, be proud, yes. And raise your hand if you see kind of a younger girl in this photo. Okay, so yeah, y'all know this, good, okay. So as you can see, the same image, two different pictures. And that's kind of the concept that we wanted to do to test perception around productivity for developers and engineers. What we did, again, same picture, two different images. We showed three different hypothetical representations of what a working environment might look like for a developer. Team A showed merged PRs, Team B showed average churn per commit, and Team C showed average cycle time per each month. Now, we don't have to go into the nitty-gritty. I know we're already trying to churn and kind of think about what we're looking at, but one thing we'll take about, kind of focus on, is Team C, which is where we saw the most variance. When we showed this to developers and product folks, we had two completely different answers. We asked, this chart is considered a normal trend in productivity, right? Developer productivity, is that the same? Developers, 75% of them said, yes, this is very normal, this is a day in the life, this is what happens, this is considered a normal trend. On the contrary, the flip-flop like Carol was talking about, product folks were like, oh no, something is wrong here, this is not normal, this is completely different, something's gone awry. And while that happens often in teams, the most important thing to take away from this is that you're looking at one picture and seeing two different things. There are two different perceptions on what's going on. In addition to that, 75%, of course, is not 100%. So that also points to the fact that there is a bunch of developers who are thinking this is actually not normal. So while there might be misalignment around productivity with developers and product, it's also true that even developers think differently about their own productivity, as Carol mentioned. So yes, it's very important that we're aligning on that to make sure that we are reaching the same goal of success. So that might be the case of why not to mind read. So what should we do? In these interviews, we talked to those same folks, and they suggested 3 critical things to making sure we're aligned on productivity and therefore team success. The first is effective communication. Not a huge shocker. I'm sure we all know that it's important to effectively communicate while in a work environment. But what this unlocks, as a lot of product managers and developers talked about, was not only are the communications a lot smoother, but you're also able to have way more effective planning sessions. And not only planning sessions, but the pre-planning before you start a sprint, before you do anything, is that conversation before you start the project is imperative. For example, one product manager said, the pre-planning is important. It's like a backstage conversation before the big finale. A developer even echoed that by saying, the preparation is the key to success. It's the only thing that's super important. So you're seeing on both sides of the house, not just product folks saying this, not just developers saying this, but both sides of the house in those 17 hours of interviews, folks are pointing to the critical component of alignment in the planning sessions to reach success. And another theme that we saw within that are not only effective communication or alignment, but how important domain knowledge is. And we don't mean domain knowledge in terms of developers knowing developer work and PMs knowing PM work. We're talking about knowing the other side of the house. For example, one product manager said, when engineers get a sense for what the user's pain points are, it helps them understand the workflow better. In addition, a developer said, when PMs understand the developer workflow, they understand infrastructure and what we can achieve within a certain time frame. So that's so important. Let's just take a second for that. Not only just to make it very clear what we're going towards and have effective communication there, but it's also important to understand the other side. So while productivity might be misunderstood or understood in different ways, defined in different ways, we might be trying to mind read that, communication, planning, and domain knowledge are critical to reaching team success. Now, that all sounds great. That's all well and good. But my specialty is also in inclusive design research, and we would be remiss if we did not talk about the most important thing that came through these interviews was all this is not possible without trust. And this has been a theme. We've been listening to these wonderful talks, and it's really important that we've been seeing this, is how important this is. It's not really an optional thing, actually. It seems like it might be a nice to have, but it's so critical because without trust fostered on your team, without taking that extra step to ask a person where they're from, what they do, learn about their lives, all of those different components around communication, careful planning, domain knowledge can't be possible, and therefore it's going to be very, very difficult for you all to reach team success. We dove into this in another study with 9 different developers to kind of ask them what leads them to success. And without getting too far into it, because this is a bigger study, we came up with this thing called the trust ecosystem. And at the very, very high level, there are different components to it that either create bridges to that team success or barriers to that team success. And at the very fundamental level, what we want to walk away with is this very bottom part, which is around human context and empathy at the foundational level. If there's anything to walk away with today, think about that. Human context and empathy. Making sure you're investing in those is critical to reaching team success, reaching an alignment, making sure you're not mind reading. We had one quote from a product manager that I want to read out here, which was so beautiful about this. And he said, I had a team that I worked with from 2020 to 2021, and we had stellar collaboration because we built that trust. How do you make people feel safe to trust? It starts with me opening up. It's being able to share my experiences. It's allowing everyone to feel comfortable enough to share their lives. It's not an overnight process. I'll repeat that again. It's not an overnight process. There isn't just one point where we've built trust. You look back on a situation, you're like, oh, well, over the course of a period of time, things started being a lot more cohesive. So if anything, we want to share, yes, there might be misalignment. Yes, we might be trying to mind read. But as long as we're trying to understand the other person, understand the other side of things, whether on your developer team, with your product leaders, or even with your design team, you'll be able to reach that team's success. Thank you. Oh, this is...